All right, so for this deep dive, we've got some fascinating material to dig into from a YouTube conversation, with Joe Rogan and Dr. Suzanne Humphries. And it looks like it's from March 2025.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so pretty recent. I know you're already familiar with their work, but for our listeners, Dr. Humphries, she's a nephrologist, right?
Yes.
And she really dives deep into vaccine research, and she co-authored that book, Dissolving Illusions.
Mm.
So this conversation, it's all about vaccines and immunity,
Mm-hmm.
going beyond those headlines and those kind of like prepackaged narrative.
Right, right.
Our mission here, like always, is to really understand the perspectives presented in this conversation.
Yeah.
And, we want to make it relevant for you, the learner.
Absolutely.
We know that not everyone has a medical degree, so we'll break down anything complicated, avoid jargon. Like no one wants a medical school lecture, right? We're going for a good conversation.
Exactly. And I think this material, it's going to spark some good discussion.
Definitely, I think so. So right off the bat, they emphasize this idea of having an open mind, especially when it comes to health, vaccines in particular.
Yes.
They even talk about the potential for what they call indoctrination, and how profit can be a huge factor driving that. What do you think about that, just starting there?
Well, I think it's a critical point to consider, you know, who benefits from the information being shared, and are there any financial incentives that might be shaping the narrative around vaccines? It's a question worth asking.
Yeah, because if the advice you're getting is coming from a place where the primary goal is to, sell a product or push a certain agenda,
Right. Yeah.
then how much can you trust it?
Right, exactly. It's about having that critical lens, questioning and evaluating the information for yourself.
And they go on to talk about natural remedies, which I thought was interesting because it's like they start by acknowledging how often these remedies, like cinnamon, garlic, echinacea,
Mm.
they get dismissed as kind of like folksy medicine.
Like grandma's remedies, not to be taken seriously.
But then they go on to say, well, hold on. There actually might be some benefit to these things, like cinnamon for glucose handling.
Right.
Garlic's pretty good for certain infections.
Mm-hmm.
And they even bring up vitamin C as potentially being, a key ingredient in those old school remedies.
Mm.
And it makes you think.
It does make you wonder about the role of nutrition, maybe, in historical medical practices and how we've kind of moved away from that in many ways.
Right. So this next part really caught my attention. They delve into vitamin A and its relationship to measles.
Yeah.
So they claim that whether you get measles naturally or through the vaccine, it can lead to a depletion of vitamin A.
Interesting.
And then they suggest that maybe taking vitamin A supplements after vaccination could be helpful, which is not something you typically hear recommended, right?
No, not at all. It makes you think, are there potential impacts of vaccination that maybe we're not fully aware of or that aren't routinely addressed? If vitamin A levels do decrease after measles, whether it's the natural infection or the vaccine, then maybe there's a case for considering some supportive measures more often.
Yeah, like why wouldn't we, right?
Exactly.
And then they touch on something that I think a lot of people just assume. We tend to think of pharmaceutical products, vaccines included, as being very standardized. Like they're all exactly the same.
Right, like a recipe.
Right.
You expect the same outcome every time.
But their argument is that there can actually be quite a bit of variability in how these products are produced and in how people respond to them.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying they're challenging this idea of a completely uniform product.
Yeah, and a predictable outcome every time.
That's a really interesting point. If there are these significant differences from batch to batch, as they suggest, it could help explain why we see such a wide range of reactions to vaccines. Some people have no problems and others experience side effects.
Right. So they tie this variability into the issue of legal immunity for vaccine manufacturers.
Ah, okay.
They bring up that whole situation with the swine flu vaccine back in 1976 and how the government had to step in and provide legal protection.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. And their suggestion is that this legal shield might have actually led to more vaccine development.
So are they implying that because manufacturers have less liability, there's less incentive to be as rigorous with safety testing?
It seems like you're at least raising that question,
Yeah.
like has this legal protection maybe inadvertently lowered the bar for safety? It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, we want innovation, but not at the expense of safety.
Right, right. And then the conversation takes a really personal turn. The expert shares their own journey, starting as someone who really believed in vaccines. But then around 2008, 2009, they started seeing influenza vaccines causing kidney failure in some patients.
Oh, wow.
And they realized that vaccine history, the potential downsides, that wasn't really emphasized in their medical training.
That's powerful, to have your own experiences challenge your deeply held beliefs. And it raises concerns about whether medical professionals are getting a comprehensive enough education on vaccines.
Right, like are we really getting the whole picture?
It seems like they're suggesting that maybe we're not.
So this experience with the flu vaccine, it led them down what they call the polio bunny trail. Even though the initial concern was the flu shot, polio kept coming up. And of course, the dominant narrative is, Jonas Salk the vaccine, polio eradicated, end of story.
Right, that's the story we all grew up with.
But here's where they start challenging that very narrative.
Oh, okay. I'm interested to hear this.
So one of their arguments is that polio might still be around, just diagnosed differently.
Okay, so they're saying it's not eradicated, it's just hidden under different labels.
Exactly. They talk about how the definition of polio changed around the time the vaccine was introduced. So maybe, that drop in reported cases wasn't entirely due to the vaccine. It was also because of how cases were being classified.
That makes sense. If the criteria for diagnosis changed, it would definitely impact the numbers.
Right. And they point out that testing for the polio virus itself only became widespread after the vaccine was introduced. So before that, it wasn't standard practice to actually confirm if someone had the virus.
So are they saying some cases labeled as polio might not have actually been polio?
Yeah, they even suggest that some of those paralysis cases pre-vaccine might have been caused by other things altogether.
Like what?
Guillain-Barré syndrome, they mentioned.
Oh, okay.
Coxsackie virus, echovirus, even lead poisoning and mercury poisoning, which were, more common back then.
Yeah, and those can cause neurological problems too.
Right. And then they bring up this really striking correlation between DDT production, the pesticide, and polio diagnoses. Their point is that the timelines match up. And they note that in countries where DDT was still being used, paralytic polio persisted.
That's a pretty strong argument for an environmental cause, or at least a contributing factor.
They also mention those early polio outbreaks happening mostly in rural communities.
Interesting.
And they speculate about a possible link to sheep and cow dipping, which involved arsenic sometimes.
Arsenic, yeah. I mean, that's known to cause neurological problems too, right?
Exactly. So they're basically suggesting that maybe it wasn't just the polio virus itself causing all these cases of paralysis.
Right, like there were other factors at play that we might not have fully considered.
And then they drop this stat that really kind of changes your perspective. 95 to 99% of polio infections are asymptomatic.
Whoa, so most people who get the virus don't even know they have it.
Apparently so.
Well, that kind of changes the whole picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, it makes you think, maybe it's not this terrifying, universally debilitating disease in most cases.
Right, like maybe it's a commensal virus, mostly harmless.
And they mentioned the Javante Indians, who apparently showed immunity to all 3 polio strains without having any paralytic disease.
Huh. So natural immunity is possible.
It seems so.
That definitely challenges the idea that the vaccine was the only way to achieve immunity.
Then they talk about how viruses tend to become less virulent over time, that natural process of attenuation.
Right, right.
But then they bring up this rather unsettling bit of history about a 1916 Rockefeller lab experiment in Manhattan.
Okay.
They claim that they were trying to create a more potent strain of polio,
Oh, wow.
and it was accidentally released.
Oh, no.
Led to a really bad epidemic with high death rates. But then after that, the virus did become less virulent.
So are they suggesting that maybe human intervention actually made polio worse in that case?
That's the implication, yeah, which is pretty disturbing to think about.
It definitely raises questions about early research practices.
Right, like what were they thinking?
And if the virus did naturally attenuate after that, it makes you wonder how much of the decline in polio was really due to the vaccine.
Okay, so then they move on to vaccine-derived polio.
Vaccine-derived polio.
Yeah, basically, the live virus in the oral polio vaccine, sometimes it can mutate and cause the disease.
I see.
And they say this is still a concern in some parts of the world where the oral vaccine is still used. In the U.S., they stopped using the oral sugar cube vaccine because of cases of vaccine-derived polio.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They even suggest that those early injected polio vaccines might have caused more paralysis than they prevented.
Wow, that's a big claim.
Yeah.
So they're directly challenging the idea that those early vaccines were entirely beneficial.
Exactly. And to wrap up the polio discussion, they talk about how some things we associate with polio might be diagnosed differently today.
Okay.
Like iron lungs. Those are basically ventilators now, right?
Right.
And transverse myelitis, that has a lot of similarities to what was historically seen as polio. So the point is, maybe the name polio has become less common, but the underlying conditions still exist, just under different names.
That's a good point. Like, we might not be seeing the full picture if we're just looking at polio case numbers.
Then they briefly mention tonsillectomies.
Okay.
Their suggestion is that, before jumping to surgery, maybe we should try things like gargling with sodium ascorbate, dietary changes, addressing allergies.
So, a more conservative, holistic approach.
Right, exploring those less invasive options first. Now, this next part is something we've heard before, but it's worth revisiting. They talk about how the aluminum adjuvant in some vaccines, it might be skewing the immune response
Okay.
towards a Th2 response, which is linked to allergies, rather than a Th1 response, which is what you need to fight off infections.
Right. So the Th1 response is kind of like your body's frontline defense against those immediate threats. And the Th2 response is more involved in those longer term things like allergies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And their concern is that aluminum might be pushing the immune system too much towards Th2. And then they really go deep on the benefits of breast milk, like way beyond basic nutrition.
Okay.
They talk about short-chain fatty acids for gut health, how it trains the baby's immune system. They mention specific components like hamlet, which has anti-tumor properties,
Oh.
stem cells, activated T cells with DLE, which is dialysable leukocyte extract.
ELE.
Yeah, it's essentially a bunch of immune signaling molecules that can actually transfer some of the mother's immune memory to the baby. And they point out how breastfeeding seems to influence the baby's response to vaccination.
In what way?
It might shift it more towards that Th1 response that we were talking about.
Interesting. So breast milk is like setting the stage for a healthy immune response.
Right. And they made this connection between the historical decline in breastfeeding, the rise of contaminated infant formula, and potentially polio.
Huh. That's a thought-provoking connection.
Moving to the history of smallpox then. They claim that back in the late 1600s, smallpox was actually considered pretty treatable with supportive care.
Really?
Yeah, they suggest that the big problem came with the Industrial Revolution, people crammed into cities, bad sanitation, just like terrible living conditions,
Yeah, that makes sense.
which really challenges that narrative we all heard growing up, that vaccines were the sole reason for the decline of smallpox.
It definitely adds more nuance to the story.
And they talk about early public health efforts, like people
Ugh.
putting in public drinking fountains.
Oh, interesting. So improvements in sanitation and hygiene played a big role.
Right. And then they get into those old school treatments for smallpox, which were pretty intense, bloodletting, induced vomiting, diarrhea. They even used mercury and arsenic compounds.
Oh, wow.
But here's the thing. They bring up how arsenic trioxide is actually used in traditional Chinese medicine for certain conditions. Yeah, so it's like the same substance can have different effects depending on the dose. And this leads them to mercury, being used as an antimicrobial in vaccines, even though we know it's toxic.
Right.
They discuss the different forms of mercury, how they're processed by the body, but they generally agree that mercury is a neurotoxin and there's probably no safe level. And they point out the irony of treating spilled mercury-containing vaccines as hazardous waste while injecting them into people.
Yeah, that's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it?
They also talk about how any public questioning of vaccines is often met with really strong resistance. Like you're not allowed to have doubts.
Right. Like it's almost taboo to question vaccines.
They bring up historical accounts of deaths after smallpox vaccination.
Oh.
They mention tuberculosis as a reported side effect, even affecting the inventor's child and some of his test subjects. And they talk about how some doctors back then were concerned about vaccination, but there was pressure and mandates from the government. They even mentioned this 1984 U.S. Federal Register directive that basically said any doubts about vaccine safety must not be allowed to exist.
Wow, that's pretty heavy-handed. So they're suggesting that maybe there's been a historical effort to suppress any negative information about vaccines?
Yeah, it's like they're saying we're not getting the full story. And then they claim that Jenner's initial smallpox vaccine introduction, it didn't involve any proper controlled studies.
Really? That's surprising considering how foundational that vaccine is considered to be.
Right. You would think there'd be tons of rigorous research behind it.
So are they suggesting that maybe the whole foundation of vaccination is based on shaky ground?
It seems like they're at least raising that possibility, like maybe we need to re-examine some of these fundamental assumptions. Then they shift gears a bit and talk about the COVID-19 situation as it was in March 2025. They mention the recommendation for vaccinating 6-month-old babies,
Wow. Okay.
concerns about potential stem cell damage in pregnant women, and the placenta.
That's a serious concern.
Reports of SV40 and other unexpected things found in some vaccine batches. And, of course, the financial incentives for hospitals and doctors to administer the vaccines.
Right. Those financial incentives always raise questions about motives.
So this leads them into a discussion about cancer and vaccines, specifically SV40, that simian virus 40. They make the claim that overall cancer rates have actually increased since the start of mass vaccination.
Huh. That's an interesting correlation.
They talk about how those early polio vaccines were made using African green monkey kidney cells.
Right.
And this researcher, Dr. Bernice Eddy, she discovered SV40 in those cells. It's a virus that can cause cancer in animals.
I see.
They allege that this information was suppressed initially.
Suppressed? Why would they do that?
Well, it might have caused panic or undermined confidence in the vaccine program.
Yeah, I guess so.
But apparently, this guy, Maurice Helleman, he confirmed the presence of SV40.
Okay.
Now, SV40, it seems to be harmless in African green monkeys.
Okay.
But in humans, it might have some negative effects. They even claim that it could be contagious among people now.
Oh, wow.
And they talk about potential health problems linked to SV40, like kidney issues, lung problems, brain tumors. There's a connection made back to the polio days by this Dr. Michele Carboni in a book called The Virus and the Vaccine.
So they're suggesting that this monkey virus might be contributing to human diseases.
Yeah, and they say those contaminated vaccine stocks, they might have been used all the way up until the 1990s.
1990s, that's not that long ago.
And of course, there's a lack of long-term studies on the health effects of SV40. They mentioned one study that was supposedly stopped early.
Why would they stop a study like that?
That's a good question. They point to a possible correlation between increased rates of kidney cancer and exposure to SV40.
And that makes sense, given the origin of the virus.
Right, and a link between SV40 and certain kidney diseases, specifically those that involve protein loss.
So they're building a case for a connection between this monkey virus and human health problems.
Exactly. And then they touch on the really sensitive topic of autism.
Yeah, that's always a tough one.
They claim that there's been this intense suppression of information about potential links to vaccines, despite the experiences of a lot of parents.
Right, like there are a lot of parents who feel like their concerns haven't been taken seriously.
Absolutely. And then they circle back to COVID-19.
Okay.
They talk about what they see as very strong propaganda surrounding the vaccine effort, the social stigma faced by the unvaccinated,
Oh, yeah.
and they contrast the experiences of people who recovered naturally with those who were vaccinated and still got sick multiple times.
So they're questioning the effectiveness of the vaccines, especially against those newer variants.
Right, and they bring up this concept called original antigenic sin, or linked epitope suppression, suggesting that maybe it was leading to negative efficacy in some cases.
Negative efficacy.
Yeah, meaning the vaccine was actually making things worse. And they even mention that some scientists like Fauci and Morens have acknowledged limitations with the COVID vaccines.
So even some mainstream voices were recognizing that these vaccines weren't perfect.
Exactly. They then ask a really provocative question. If there's been so much research on gain of function, why don't we have readily available cures for more diseases?
That's a good question. You would think all that research would lead to some breakthroughs.
They also bring up these alleged contractual obligations between governments and pharmaceutical companies, supposedly requiring there to be no alternative treatments available for a vaccine to get emergency use authorization.
Oh, wow. So are they suggesting that this might be hindering the promotion of other therapies that could work?
Yeah, like maybe there's a financial incentive to not have any competition for the vaccines.
That's concerning.
And they share some anecdotal stories of people recovering from COVID really quickly, including a 95-year-old with lung disease and a senior partner with leukemia.
Interesting.
And their point is, there doesn't seem to be much interest in figuring out why these people recovered so rapidly.
Right, like maybe there's something to be learned from those cases.
Absolutely. They also discuss that whole horse dewormer narrative surrounding ivermectin
Oh,
and
yeah.
how they see it as a distortion in the media.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about censorship, scientists and doctors getting kicked off social media for having dissenting views.
Right, which raises concerns about freedom of speech and scientific inquiry,
And then there's the retraction of certain medical papers.
which makes you wonder, what's the agenda there?
Right, is there something they're trying to hide? And then the expert shares some of their own personal shifts in perspective, how they went from believing that vaccines were the sole reason we were saved from polio and smallpox to questioning that narrative.
I see. So their own research and experiences led them to change their mind.
They mention books by Robert F. Kennedy Jr.,
Oh, yeah.
this book called Turtles All the Way Down, and a counter-pro-vaccine book with a similar title.
So they were exposed to a wider range of viewpoints.
And then they share this anecdote about questioning the need for a tetanus vaccine for a child in a Steiner school.
Okay.
And they realized they actually knew very little about tetanus itself. And they reiterate that polio is often used as the main argument in favor of vaccination.
So it's like a cornerstone of the pro-vaccine argument.
Right.
Yeah.
But they've already kind of deconstructed that narrative.
Yeah. They've raised a lot of doubts about the conventional story of polio.
So this leads them to do a deep dive specifically into tetanus.
Okay.
They talk about where tetanus spores come from, the gut of ruminant animals and soil, and how infection requires an anaerobic environment in a wound, no oxygen. They contrast those images we often see of severe tetanus with the reality that it's actually treatable. Yeah, especially if you catch it early. They even mention research on high-dose vitamin C being beneficial in rabbits.
Vitamin C for tetanus. I've never heard that.
They emphasize the importance of proper wound cleaning, maybe even leaving a dirty wound open initially.
Huh.
They talk about historical instances of tetanus contamination, like in menstrual pads.
Interesting.
They also point out that the tetanus vaccine doesn't give you a 100% guarantee.
So even with the vaccine, you can still get tetanus.
And they discuss different strains of tetanus, how people living around livestock might develop natural immunity.
That makes sense.
And they mention that you can find information about tetanus, including their discussions about vitamin C, on the Odyssey channel.
Okay.
The expert then describes their own big shift in understanding medical history. How they went from feeling like just a glorified pharmaceutical technician to embracing a more holistic view of healing.
So they're moving away from just prescribing pills and towards a more whole body approach.
Right. Lifestyle, nutrition, alternative therapies.
That's great.
They talk about the limitations of conventional medical training, how a lot of it is focused on just treating symptoms rather than addressing root causes.
Right, like putting a Band-Aid on the problem instead of actually fixing it.
And they mention the resistance they've encountered in exploring therapies like mercury detoxification.
Yeah, there's a lot of pushback against anything that challenges the status quo.
And they even share this anecdote of developing really severe hypertension after getting a tetanus shot.
Oh, wow. That's concerning.
So then they emphasize this idea that most disease actually stems from inflammation.
Okay.
And that a lot of those things we see as problems, like high cholesterol, fever, those are often the body's attempts to heal itself.
So instead of suppressing those responses, maybe we should be trying to understand what's causing them.
Exactly. And this leads them to a call for medical freedom, for people to have choices in their healthcare.
Right, like informed consent and patient autonomy.
And not to be shamed for seeking wellness through different paths.
Exactly.
They also talk about how there hasn't been much effort to directly refute the claims in their book through open discussion. They prefer written debate over those, live debates that can turn into shouting matches.
Yeah.
Their point is, if you're confident in your position, you should be able to present your case clearly and calmly.
Yeah, it's about having a reasoned, evidence-based discussion.
Right. And finally, they address the argument that increased lifespan is primarily due to medical interventions.
Okay.
Their counterargument is that only a small percentage, maybe around 3.5%, is attributable to things like antibiotics and vaccines. The vast majority of the increase in lifespan is due to improvements in public health, clean water, sanitation, better nutrition, the end of child labor.
Right, those fundamental things that create a healthy environment.
Exactly. So we've covered a lot of ground here, some really complex information, challenging conventional wisdom.
Yeah, it's been a lot to take in.
But our goal was to explore these alternative perspectives. We're not saying we agree with everything they say, but it's important to consider these ideas.
Right, to think critically and do your own research.
So what are you taking away from this conversation? What are some of the key questions that are swirling around in your head right now? Like, how do those natural remedies they mentioned actually work?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too.
Where can we find detailed analyses of the studies they referenced?
Mm-hmm.
And what about those long-term health outcomes for people exposed to SV40, through those early polio vaccines. There's so much to explore.
Absolutely. It makes you want to dive deeper into the research and see what you can find out for yourself.
For those of you who want to learn more, Dr. Humphries' book, Dissolving Illusions, both the original and the 10th anniversary edition, which includes new chapters on tuberculosis, the history of toxic medicine, and whooping cough, is available at dissolvingillusions.com. They also mention their second book, a compilation of doctor quotes, and their timeline of vaccine tragedies.
Definitely worth checking out.
So here's a final thought for you. Given everything we've discussed, the historical context, the alternative perspectives, how might this change your own approach to health information and decision-making?
It's a good question for all of us to consider.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a journey.
Yeah, it really has.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those minds open.
Absolutely.
See you soon.
See you later.